The air in the Curia had grown stale long before Claudius's final poisoned mushroom. It was the thick, stagnant air of fear. For years, we senators had gathered not as the fathers of the Republic, the patres conscripti, but as frightened men playing a part. We learned to keep our eyes downcast, our opinions malleable, and our praise for the emperor's freedmen, Pallas and Narcissus, as lavish as it was insincere. A single whispered word, a misinterpreted glance in the direction of the imperial box, could mean exile to a barren rock, or a quiet visit from a centurion with a blade. My name is Lucius Marcius Philippus, and my family has held a seat in this house since the days of the kings. My bones ached with the memory of better days, of true debate, of a Rome that felt governed, not merely owned by one man's whims. Then Claudius was dead, and the boy Nero was emperor, 17 years old. We all knew who had put him there. His mother, Agrippina, the she-wolf who had placed her cub on the throne, watched from the shadows, her ambition a palpable force in the city. We expected more of the same, perhaps worse. A boy tyrant, manipulated by a power-hungry mother. We gathered for his first address to us with a familiar sense of dread tightening our chests. He entered the Curia flanked not by fawning courtiers, but by the Stoic Praetorian prefect, Burrus, and his tutor, the philosopher Seneca. That was the first surprise. Nero himself was a striking youth, with his reddish-blonde hair and a face that was still soft with adolescence, yet possessed of a certain artistic sensitivity. He looked nervous, his eyes scanning the rows of stern, old faces that stared back at him. He took his place, and a hush fell over the chamber, heavy with a century of autocracy. He began to speak. The words were not his own. They had the polished, philosophical cadence of Seneca. But the delivery, the earnestness, was all Nero. He did not speak of his divine right or his absolute power. Instead, he spoke of partnership. He spoke of restoring the maestas, the dignity of the Senate. The secret trials that have cast a pall over this great body will end, he declared, his voice, though young, carrying to the furthest marble benches. Justice will be public, and it will be fair. The affairs of the state, the treasury of our great republic, shall be separate from the affairs of my house. The corruption that has enriched the few at the expense of the many will be rooted out. A murmur rippled through the hall. I glanced at my neighbor, old Servius Galba, a man whose face was a roadmap of political survival. His eyebrows were raised in disbelief. Nero continued, seeming to gain confidence from our stunned silence. You, conscript fathers, will have your ancient authority over the provinces restored. You will adjudicate, you will legislate. My role, as princeps, will be to command the legions and protect the frontiers of our empire. I will be the first among equals, not the master of slaves. He was undoing Claudius. He was undoing Caligula. He was, in his words, attempting to turn the clock back to the golden age of Augustus, to the very ideal of the principate that had been so corrupted by his predecessors. He was offering us our power back. However, will this power come with a price? Some thought about it for a long moment. After Nero finished his speech in the Senate, no one moved. The air, once so stale, now crackled with a possibility we had forgotten existed. Was it a trick? A carefully crafted performance to lull us into complacency before the axe fell? I looked at the boy on the dais. I saw the flush on his cheeks, the genuine desire for approval in his eyes, and behind him I saw the steady gaze of Seneca, the philosopher who believed in a virtuous ruler. Then one senator, then another, rose to his feet. A slow, hesitant applause began, like the first drops of a long-awaited rain. It grew, swelling into a thunderous ovation that shook the very statues of our ancestors. Men who had not shown genuine emotion in a decade were cheering, some with tears in their eyes. I found myself standing, my hands clapping, a surge of forgotten hope warming my old veins. Leaving the Curia, the light of the Forum seemed brighter. The mood on the streets felt lighter. For the first time in my adult life, it felt as though a window had been thrown open in a locked room. We had a philosopher king, or at least a student of one. We had a chance. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my villa on the Palatine, looking down at the sprawling, breathing city below. The promise of this new era was seductive, but even then, a sliver of old cynicism remained. Power is a poison, and it works slowly. I had seen the look in Agrippina's eyes at the public announcement. She had not forged a crown for her son, only to see him give away its jewels. We were celebrating a sunrise, blind to the bonfire it would one day become. But for that one glorious day, Rome dared to hope again, and I, an old man who thought he had seen everything, hoped along with it. The months that followed were unlike any I had known since my own youth. When the shadow of Tiberius had not yet fallen across the Palatine, the promises made in that first address were not the empty rhetoric of a new tyrant seeking to placate us. They began to take root in the soil of Roman life. Seneca, a man whose quiet words could move legions of thought, would bring proposals. Before us, and Nero, ever the attentive student, would watch from his seat, listening, really listening. We were invited to debate, to argue, to amend. At first, we were like men freed from a dark cell, blinking in. The sun, our voices hoarse from disuse. But slowly, the old habits of vigorous discourse returned. The most significant change came in the form of a sweeping judicial decree. One day, a list was posted in the Forum, naming dozens of notorious delatores, the professional, informers who had grown rich under Claudius by fabricating treason charges against wealthy men. They were to be tried publicly for their crimes. Their wealth, ill-gotten through judicial murder, was to be seized not by the emperor's household, but by the public treasury, the aerarium Saturni, which was now firmly back under Senate control. I myself presided over the trial of one such creature, a wretched man named Suilius Rufus, whose whispers had sent better men than I to their deaths. As he stood before me, stripped of his finery, his face pale and sweating, I saw not a powerful courtier, but a simple parasite shivering now that its host was dead. The evidence was irrefutable. We, the Senate, condemned him to exile, and the crowd in the Forum roared its approval. Justice was no longer a private commodity to be bought and sold in the darkened halls of the palace. It was Roman again. Following this, Nero, guided by Seneca's hand, turned his attention to the lifeblood of the common man. Taxes. The system was rotten to its core. Tax farmers, the infamous publicani, squeezed provinces dry, their greed backed by imperial force. Nero's initial proposal, presented to us by Seneca, was breathtaking in its audacity: to abolish all indirect taxes throughout the empire. A collective gasp sucked the air from the chamber. To do away with the customs duties, the sales taxes, it was madness. Glorious, but utter madness. Old Cassius Longinus, a man whose pragmatism was exceeded only by his wealth, rose to his feet. "Noble princeps," he began, his voice dripping with condescension for the boy emperor. "A noble sentiment. But how, pray tell, do we pay for the grain dole, for the legions on the Rhine, for the aqueducts that give this city life?" He had a point, and for a moment the old fear returned. Would Nero see this challenge as an insult? Would the boy's temper flare? Instead, Nero looked to Seneca, who simply nodded at the Senate as if to say, "This is your problem to solve." And solve it we did. For 3 days we debated. I found myself on my feet, my voice ringing with a passion I thought long dead, arguing not for abolition but for radical reform. Citing precedents from the early Republic, I proposed that the tax laws, which were often kept secret by the publicani to entrap the populace, be inscribed on bronze tablets and displayed publicly, that all tax disputes be moved from the jurisdiction of the tax farmers themselves to independent courts here in Rome, that the rates be capped and the aediles be empowered to crack down on illegal fees at the markets. It was a true compromise, forged in the fires of real debate. When the final proposal was laid before Nero, he smiled, a genuine, unaffected smile of youthful enthusiasm. "The fathers have spoken with the wisdom of ages," he said, his voice clear and proud. Let it be so. That act did more to secure his popularity than 1,000 triumphs. Throughout the city, the name of Nero was praised. He was not just an emperor, he was a benefactor, a true father of his country. Yet, as the new bronze tablets were being hammered into place by the Temple of Saturn, I saw Agrippina passing by in her litter. Her face, framed by the curtains, was a mask of cold fury. We were not merely reforming the state, we were dismantling her web of influence. The treasury, which she had viewed as her personal purse, was no longer hers to command. The courts, where her enemies could be quietly disposed of, now operated in the light. In his quest to be loved by the Senate and the people, her son was giving away the very instruments of power she had killed to give him. I exchanged a look with my old friend Galba as her litter disappeared towards the palace. The hope that had warmed my veins now felt fragile, like a glass vessel filled with light. We had won a great victory for Rome, but in doing so we had made an enemy of the one person who could still reach the emperor's ear when the philosopher and the prefect were not looking. We were reforging the Republic in the Senate House, unaware that the true battle for Rome's soul would be fought not with laws, but with poison and daggers within the emperor's own family. The echoes of that senatorial victory were still warming our halls when Jupiter sent a test of our new princeps's character. A fire, born in a baker's oven in the Subura, devoured a swathe of the Caelian hill, leaving thousands homeless and destitute overnight. In the days of Claudius, the response would have been a slow, bureaucratic affair, a dole of grain handed out weeks later by a surly prefect. Nero was different. He did not send orders from the gilded safety of the Palatine, he went himself. His purple-bordered toga stained with soot, his face streaked with grime. I saw him with my own eyes, not posing for the crowd, but directing the vigils, comforting a weeping woman who had lost her home and lifting a child from the rubble. He opened the Campus Martius and his own private gardens to the homeless, and, from his own treasury, not the aerarium, he paid for food and temporary shelter. He spoke of building wider streets and using fire-resistant stone for new tenements. He was not just an emperor, he was Rome's own son, tending to her wounds. This wave of clemency did not stop at the city's scorched earth. A few weeks later, Seneca presented another proposal, one that struck at an even more ancient pillar of Roman life than the publicani, the absolute power of a master over his slave. The decree was simple yet revolutionary: any slave who could prove repeated and unjust cruelty at the hands of their master could appeal directly to the city prefect for redress. The prefect would have the authority to force the sale of the slave to a new, more humane master. The chamber erupted. To many of the old guard, this was not justice, it was anarchy. It was an assault on the sacred rights of the paterfamilias. You would have us answer to our own property? Snarled a senator from the Claudian clan, his face crimson. You would arm the very tools in our hands against us? But Seneca, with Nero's silent backing, held firm. He spoke not of abstract rights, but of Roman stability. A desperate slave is a dangerous man, he argued, his voice calm amidst the fury. A man with no hope is a man with nothing to lose. Is it not better to offer a single narrow path to justice than to allow the poison of resentment to fester in every wealthy household? Again the measure passed, carried by the weight of the emperor's manifest, will, and the support of those of us who saw the wisdom in it. It was another victory, another brick in the foundation of a renewed Rome. But with each brick we laid, we tore one from the edifice of Agrippina's power. Her response was not long in coming. It was not a whisper in the dark, but a brazen demonstration. During a reception for an Armenian delegation, as Nero sat upon the dais to receive their ambassadors, Agrippina entered the hall. She did not take a seat among the other imperial women. Instead, she began to ascend the steps of the dais itself, intending to sit on a second throne placed beside her son, to rule as co-regent in the sight of all the world. A collective breath was held. To deny her would be a public humiliation of the emperor's mother. To allow it would be to concede that she was the true power behind the throne. For a heart-stopping moment, Nero froze. Then Seneca, ever calm, leaned and murmured in his ear. Burrus, the stoic Praetorian prefect, stepped subtly forward. his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Nero stood, descended the steps, and met his mother as if to grant her a filial honor, escorting her to a seat of prominence, but one distinctly separate from his own. He handled it with grace, but the message was unmistakable. A line had been drawn. Agrippina's face was stone, but her eyes burned with a cold fire that could have turned the Tiber to ice. She had gambled and lost. That night, leaving a late session, I saw her again. She was not in her litter, but walking in a secluded portico of the palace, deep in conversation. Her companion was not a senator or a courtier. It was Britannicus, the son of Claudius. The boy was nearly a man now, with his father's slight stammer but his mother Octavia's noble bearing. He was the city's living memory, a constant silent rebuke to Nero's succession. Agrippina had her hand on his shoulder, her head inclined, her voice a low, urgent murmur. She had tried to share her son's power and been rebuffed. Now I realized with a chilling certainty she was turning to the one tool she had left to control him, the threat of a replacement. The reforms, the justice, the fires extinguished and the people fed, all of it felt suddenly fragile. We had been focused on the law tablets in the Forum, believing the battle for Rome was one of ideas. But Agrippina was reminding us that power in this city has always flowed not from bronze tablets but from bloodlines, and she controlled the only other source of imperial blood left within the palace walls. The serpent, denied the sun, had retreated to her nest to sharpen her fangs. The serpent, however, did not strike at once. She was too cunning for that. Instead, she let her poison seep into the foundations of the Palatine. Whispers began to circulate, slithering through the colonnades and Senate halls. Whispers of Britannicus's approaching 14th birthday, the day he would assume the toga virilis and officially become a man in the eyes of Rome. Whispers of how much he sounded like his deified father, Claudius, when he spoke. Whispers that the army in Germany, loyal to the Claudian name, had not forgotten the true heir. Seneca and Burrus understood the nature of this new war. It could not be fought in the Curia with decrees or on the battlefield with legions. It had to be fought in the hearts of the Roman people. If Agrippina was trading on memory, we would have to forge a new one. And so, Nero's reign entered a new phase. It was no longer enough to be a competent administrator or a merciful judge. He had to become the living embodiment of Rome's joy and prosperity. We resolved to fight her shadows with sunlight. The city, still bearing the scars of the Caelian fire, became a canvas for Nero's vision. He did not merely rebuild, he reimagined. New baths began to rise, not grim, functional structures, but airy halls of marble and mosaic, with libraries and gardens attached. He commissioned the construction of a grand new gymnasium, a place where the sons of senators and plebeians alike could train their bodies in the Hellenic ideal. I remember walking the construction site with him, the air thick with the dust of cut stone and the scent of wet plaster. He spoke not of costs and logistics, but of the way the light would fall through, a high window at dusk, of the proper proportions for a wrestling palestra. He possessed a genuine, almost feverish passion for it. He also announced the establishment of the Neronia, a grand festival of arts and athletics to be held every 5 years. There would be contests in music, poetry, and oratory right alongside the chariot races. The old guard grumbled, of course. He would have us exchange the gladius for the lyre, muttered the same Claudian senator who had decried the slave law. He is turning Roman men into Greek actors. But the people loved it. They saw an emperor who did not merely rule them from on high, but who sought to entertain and enrich them, to share his own passions with them. When Nero himself took the stage to recite a poem of his own composition, a rather overwrought epic on the fall of Troy, the applause was thunderous. It was not the sycophantic praise of the court, but the genuine adoration of a populace that felt seen and cherished. The true test, however, came during a private dinner at the palace. The Armenian delegation was being feted one last time before their departure. Agrippina was there, a study in quiet dignity, her earlier humiliations seemingly forgotten. Britannicus, too, sat among the guests. He was a quiet, almost somber boy, but that night, at his mother's urging, he was coaxed to sing for the assembly after the meal. He rose, his adolescent frame still awkward, and began a song. It was not one of the light, frivolous tunes popular at banquets. It was an old Latin ballad, a tragic tale from the Trojan cycle about a prince dispossessed of his rightful throne by a treacherous kinsman. His voice, just beginning to break, was clear and hauntingly sad. The hall fell silent. No one missed the parallel. Each note was a carefully aimed dart, and Agrippina's faint, proud smile was the Fletcher guiding its flight. When he finished, a strained silence hung in the air. All eyes turned to Nero. I saw a flicker of something in his expression, a brief, cold fury that was instantly suppressed. He rose and began to applaud, a wide, brilliant smile fixed on his face. "A superb performance, brother," he declared, his voice ringing with false warmth. "You have your father's ear for the noble tragedies." He then called for his own lyre and launched into a loud, boisterous song that shattered the poignant atmosphere Britannicus had created. He played the charming host to perfection, but I saw the tremor in the hand that held the plectrum. I saw the way his eyes kept darting towards the boy, and then to his mother. We were building a magnificent new Rome of stone and marble, of poetry and public games. But beneath the gleaming facade, Agrippina's poison was doing its work. The sunlight we were pouring onto the city could not penetrate the growing darkness in the princeps's own heart. We had given the people an artist on the throne, but she was busy reminding him that he was also a rival, and that some tragedies do not end when the song is over. They end in blood. The victory over Parthia came the following spring, a triumph of diplomacy. That should have been the crowning jewel of our sunlit strategy. In a spectacle of unparalleled grandeur, Nero placed the diadem upon the head of Tiridates, the Armenian king in the Roman Forum itself. The city erupted in a festival of triumph that lasted for days. Here was peace, secured not by bloodshed, but by the magnanimous authority of its princeps. The people adored him for it. They saw the gleam of Parthian silk, tasted the free wine, and heard the roar of the crowd. And they knew their emperor was a bringer of prosperity, a golden god in human form. Even Agrippina, seated prominently on the rostra, had to smile and applaud the son who had so thoroughly eclipsed her. But I watched her eyes, and they were not the eyes of a proud mother. They were the eyes of a master strategist calculating the cost of a lost battle, already planning the next campaign. The public triumph, however, only seemed to deepen the private malady. Nero's artistic passions, once a source of genuine joy, took on a frantic, almost desperate quality. He would spend entire nights composing, his household staff commanded to listen in rapt silence as he declaimed verses that grew progressively darker, filled with themes of betrayal and kinslaying. A senator clearing his throat during a recitation would earn a glare of pure venom. A Praetorian guard shifting his weight at the wrong moment would be interrogated by Burrus for hours. The serpent's whispers had found fertile ground in Nero's own insecurities, and from them grew the choking weeds of paranoia. Every shadow seemed to lengthen into the shape of the boy Britannicus. Every mention of Claudius, however innocent, was a veiled comparison. I spoke with Seneca in the portico of his villa, the afternoon sun casting long, peaceful shadows across the mosaics. "The boy is a ghost at the feast," I said bluntly. "He does not need to speak. His very presence reminds men of what was, and what could have been." Seneca, ever the philosopher, traced the pattern of a labyrinth with his sandal. A farmer, Lucius, must sometimes prune a healthy-looking branch if it threatens the life of the entire tree. It is a harsh calculus, but the orchard's survival is paramount. His words chilled me more than any winter wind. Burrus, who had joined us, was less circumspect. "The Praetorians are loyal to the emperor," he said, his voice like grinding stone. "But loyalty must be simple. It cannot be divided. A choice between two brothers is no choice at all. It is an invitation to civil war. The German legions still toast Claudius's memory. What do you think will happen when his son comes of age?" They were no longer talking of outshining a rival. They were talking of extinguishing a threat. The sunlight strategy, for all its brilliance, had failed to illuminate the darkest corners of the palace. It could build baths and theatres, win the love of the plebs and the respect of foreign kings, but it could not cure the poison of fear that now coursed through Nero's veins. We had given him a stage, and he had played his part beautifully, but Agrippina had reminded him that the most famous dramas are tragedies, and that the applause of the crowd is a fickle thing. Britannicus's 14th birthday was less than a month away. I saw him once more, walking in the palace gardens with his tutors. He looked taller, his voice had settled, and there was a quiet confidence in his stride that had not been there before. He was no longer just Claudius's son, he was becoming his own man, and in that he signed his own death warrant. One evening I was leaving a late session of the Senate and saw Nero standing. Alone on a balcony overlooking the city he was so diligently beautifying. The sounds of construction were silent for the night, and the first stars were appearing in the twilight sky. He was not looking at the rising marble structures or the sprawling city below. His gaze was fixed inward, and his face, usually so animated, was a mask of cold resolve. The artist was gone. The charming host was gone. In his place stood the princeps, the high priest of Rome, preparing to make a necessary sacrifice upon the altar of the state. The tragedy had found its final act, not for the stage, but for the Palatine, and I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones like a mortal dread, that the curtain would fall on a boy's life. That chill I felt in his performance was the harbinger of a brutal winter. The days that followed the Armenian dinner were outwardly brilliant. The construction projects continued apace. Funds were dispensed for the relief of cities struck by earthquakes in Asia, and Nero's public appearances were masterpieces of gracious affability. Yet, to those of us in the palace's inner orbit, the air had grown thin and cold. Nero's laughter came a fraction too quickly, his jests had a sharper edge, and his gaze would often linger on Britannicus. With a disquieting intensity, the way a naturalist might study an insect just before pinning it to a board. Agrippina, for her part, seemed to believe she had won the exchange. She grew bolder. She would arrange for Britannicus to be accidentally present when delegations from the German legions visited, letting them see the boy who wore their beloved Claudius's face. She fanned the whispers into audible murmurs, no longer confining them to the shadows. It was a fatal miscalculation. She mistook Nero's calculated charm for weakness, his artistic temperament for a lack of resolve. She, the serpent, had forgotten that a young snake's venom can be the most potent of all. The end came during the Saturnalia. It was a time of inversion, when masters served slaves and the dice rattled all night. The palace hosted a banquet, a riot of wine, music, and forced merriment. As was tradition, a king of the feast was chosen by lot. The dice fell, as they so often do in the hands of fate or careful arrangement, to Britannicus. He sat at the head of the table, a flush of youthful pride on his cheeks, Agrippina watching him with an undisguised look of triumph. As king, he could issue commands to the other guests. He ordered one old senator to recite a bawdy poem backwards, another to dance with a wine amphora on his head. All eyes, however, were on Nero, waiting to see what petty humiliation the boy king would devise for the emperor. "For my brother, the princeps," Britannicus announced, his voice carrying clearly in a sudden lull. "I command him to stand and sing for us, but not one of his own Greek epics. Let him sing a song of the people, a common soldier's marching tune, so we might know if he remembers how real Romans sound." The insult was exquisite in its cruelty. It not only belittled Nero's artistic pursuits, but also subtly questioned his legitimacy, contrasting it with the martial heritage of the Claudians. A deathly silence fell. I saw Burrus's hand tighten on the hilt of his concealed sword. Seneca looked down at his plate as if studying the pattern on the silver. Nero's smile never wavered. "An excellent command, my king." He rose gracefully, bowed to Britannicus, and launched into a surprisingly passable rendition of a bawdy legionary song about the conquests of Julius Caesar, both military and amorous. The performance was flawless, disarming, and utterly chilling. He had met the challenge and turned it back, appearing magnanimous while yielding nothing. Later, as the wine flowed more freely, a cup was brought to Britannicus. It was his due as king of the feast. He took a sip and recoiled. "It is scalding," he complained. A servant, hovering nearby as if by prearrangement, took the cup and poured in cold water from a carafe. Britannicus drank again, deeply this time. He never finished the swallow. The cup slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the mosaic floor. A convulsion seized him. His breath came in a ragged, choking gasp. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed sideways from his couch. For a heartbeat, the revelry froze. Then panic erupted. Some guests cried out. Others scrambled to their feet, knocking over furniture. Through it all, Nero remained perfectly still, watching the dying boy with an expression of mild concern. "Do not be alarmed," he said, his voice calm and steady amidst the chaos. "It is merely one of his fits. He has been subject to them since childhood. He will recover shortly." But I was watching Agrippina. Her face, in the flickering torchlight, was a mask of utter horror. All the cunning, all the ambition, was stripped away, leaving only the raw terror of a mother who understood, in that instant, exactly what had happened. She had been outplayed. The poison she had sown in whispers had been returned to her in a golden cup. She looked from the still form of her son to the placid face of her other son, and in her eyes I saw the dawning realization that she was no longer the keeper of the beast, but merely its next meal. The guards carried Britannicus's body from the hall. The feast was over. Seneca and Burrus flanked Nero, their faces grim stone. The sunlight we had championed felt like a distant, naive dream. The artist had performed his final, terrible masterpiece, and the stage was now cleared for a tragedy written not in verse, but in blood and fear. And we, his tutors, were now the unwilling audience to the reign of the monster we had helped create. The silence that followed the removal of the body was more profound than any scream. The musicians had fallen quiet, their lyres slack in their hands. The guests, moments before a riot of colour and noise, now seemed like pale statues in a forgotten garden. No one dared to meet another's eye. Nero, having delivered his placid explanation, simply sat back down, picked a fig from a silver bowl, and began to eat it with delicate precision. That single mundane act was the true demonstration of power. He was not merely an emperor, he was a force of nature, as indifferent to the death he had caused as a winter storm is to the branch it snaps. The departure was a quiet, terrified shuffle. Senators and knights who had arrived with boisterous retinues now slipped away into the night. Their cloaks pulled tight, as if trying to shrink from the very air of the Palatine. I found myself walking beside Seneca. His face was the colour of old parchment. "Philosophy has no answer for this, Lucius," he murmured, his voice raspy. "We tried to shape him into a philosopher-king. We have given a lyre to a wolf, and now he plays a dirge upon our entrails." "He played the part of the magnanimous prince so well," I said, the words tasting like ash. "He disarmed Britannicus's insult with grace." "Grace is the predator's most effective tool," Seneca replied, his gaze lost in the darkness of the forum below. "It is the beautiful, smooth stone that hides the serpent's nest." The official funeral was a rushed, pathetic affair. The winter rains, as if summoned by the tragedy, fell in relentless sheets. The pyre was lit in the Campus Martius under a stormy sky, the smoke mingling with the clouds and disappearing without ceremony. The edict from the palace spoke of the god's will and the tragic frailty of the Claudian. Line, citing the boy's epilepsy as the cause. We all read it, we all heard it, and we all knew it for the lie it was. The lie was the point. Nero was not just killing his rival, he was killing the truth, and forcing us all to be accessories to the murder. Agrippina was a spectre at the ceremony. The iron will that had held her ramrod straight through a lifetime of intrigue had finally buckled. She stood hunched against the wind, her face bare of cosmetics, looking not like the mother of an emperor, but like any woman who had just watched the world steal her child. Her grief was real, yet it was also a political statement. Every sob that escaped her was an accusation, but it was the wail of a creature already trapped. In the weeks that followed, the winter settled in earnest. Nero, with the quiet efficiency of a master strategist, began to dismantle his mother's world. Her Praetorian Guard was respectfully, reassigned. Her German bodyguards, the fierce loyalists Claudius had gifted her, were dismissed with a generous pension and sent back across the Alps. Finally, she was moved from her expansive suite in the palace to the old Domus Antonia, the house of her grandmother. It was a comfortable prison, but a prison nonetheless. We would see her chariot in the city sometimes, a lonely figure moving through the streets she once commanded, and men would find reasons to be walking the other way. Proximity to the fallen is a contagion in this city. I saw the change in the Senate. The easy confidence of old men who believed their lineage and wealth made them untouchable was gone. It was replaced by a watchful caution. Speeches were carefully worded. Praise for the emperor became more effusive, and a new unspoken law governed every interaction. Do not provoke the artist. Do not give him a reason to compose a new masterpiece with you as its subject. One evening, I hosted a small dinner for a few old friends, men whose families, like mine, remembered the Republic. As we drank wine, watered down as was proper, old Cassius Longinus looked into the flames of the hearth. My grandfather told me that when Augustus finally secured his power, a quiet fell over Rome, he said. A quiet of exhaustion, of relief that the civil wars were over. This is a different quiet. This is the quiet of the forest when the tiger is hunting. He was right. The brutal winter that began with a chill in a song and a body on a dining room floor was now upon us. It was not a season of snow and ice, but of smiling terror and whispered fear. We, the senators of Rome, the inheritors of a glorious tradition, were no longer participants in the great drama of the state. We were merely the audience, waiting in a spreading cold darkness for the next act to begin. And we knew with a certainty that froze the marrow in our bones that the stage would require more blood yet.